Welcome back. Now, the South African population has grown by 19.8% from 51 million in 2011 to 62 million in 2022. This was revealed by Statistics South Africa at the handing over of the 2022 Census Report to President Cyril Ramaphosa at the Union Buildings yesterday. The report covered areas such as population movement, education, service delivery and disability prevalence among the areas reported on. The 2022 census is the fourth census undertaken post-1994. President Ramaphosa said that the data will inform how government plans, makes policies, budgets and distributes the country's economic resources. And joining us now virtually to talk more about this, we have Commissioner of the National Planning Commission, Professor Julian, who has previously served on a Statistics Council for 3 terms since 1994. And also with us is Director of the Centre for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule. Professor Duma, thanks so much to both of you for speaking to us this morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.
Prof, if I may, let me start with you. Firstly, your views on the report and the country's development progression since the first post-apartheid census in 1996.
Okay, on the report, I'm delighted that it's finally been released. The statistics that are contained in there are absolutely essential for national planning in all spheres of government. The undercount in the report is of concern, but I have listened to the presentation and spoken to some of the people involved. And as long as we are able to deal with whatever bias that introduces, we can manage it. It's understandable also in the context of COVID, of the period in which the survey was done, the need to change methodologies. So it's an area which I think we need to manage quite carefully. On the development in the country, well, that's a different story. You would have seen the release of the 10-year review. I think we need to be doing a lot better to be able to improve the performance of the country in terms of its development statistics. But I'm sure we can pick on that later in the interview.
Indeed. Duma, your thoughts, looking at the growth of the population size and that outstripping our economic growth trajectory. But what are your thoughts overall?
I agree with Professor May that it's a critical tool for planning purposes. It drills down to the levels of provinces, to municipalities, the lowest level of government delivery of services. Yeah, but I think Stats has got something to answer for. I looked at the figures on international migration, and it shows that there are 2.4 million international migrants in South Africa. That is 3.9% of the population. But that number is 1.5 million lower than Stats SA's own estimate that was released in August 2021 of 3.942 million. I think Stats SA has to explain why there's such a wide discrepancy between those numbers. That's first thing. Second thing, they show that the percentage of the population that are foreign nationals, international migrants, has declined from 4.2% in 2011 to 3.9%. I don't think many South Africans would regard that as a credible number. Because I don't have any. Yeah, so that's number 2. And then number 3 is that the population has increased by just over 10 million people, but the number of international migrants, according to this survey, has increased by 233,000 people. So, there's anecdotal evidence. When they came to my house, I asked at the end of the survey, are you going to ask me which country I was born in? And they said, no, it's not necessary. And anecdotal evidence from friends of mine who tried to fill it online says they weren't allowed. One friend of mine wanted to say that she's from Eswatini, and she was proud of it. And she says she couldn't find where she could fill in that detail. So it suggests, I've asked Stats SA, that there are problems with the census itself, or maybe it is, we should give them the benefit of the doubt for now, that maybe they know what they're doing, but they should explain the wide discrepancy between that number of 3.9 million, which they released in response to fake news from xenophobic organizations in South Africa to address issues of rising xenophobia in South Africa. And I am very strongly opposed to xenophobia, and I believe that we need credible statistics to have an informed debate around international migration issues. But the thing that what I think is correct in the survey is the proportion of the labor sending countries. There's about 2/3 of our international migrants are from 3 countries. These are Zimbabwe, it's about 42%. They're from Mozambique and Lesotho. Lesotho's so 17% and Lesotho 9.4%. So I think those figures, the proportions are correct, but I mean, we still need to have a bit more explanation from Stats SA about the actual number of international migrants. There might be a valid reason for this, Sakina, but I don't know what it is, yeah.
And I think that's an important point, Duma, because the credibility of this information is absolutely crucial because, Professor May, this information is, of course, critical in addressing development, and this data is utilized by government. And if the information isn't entirely correct, how does that then impact the planning that government does?
Well, the first thing always to remember is pretty much any way of counting the population or serving the population will always have an error. So even the best resource census in the world, which is probably China, would have some level of error. That means that we need to be able to understand what that error is, how it affects our results, and then we can model around that. There are good statistical procedures now that we can actually quite neatly deal with problems such as the areas that you're talking about. That probably is the reason, as Duma has pointed out, why there is the difference between the estimate, which was done a year ago, and the count now. The one would always, any estimate would always have some kind of boundaries as to what we think is an upper and a lower level of what the estimate might be. Typically, Stats SA report the midpoint, and so that's the kind of explanation that comes into when we understand why numbers might differ. The key thing with the statistics is that we use them firstly to judge our indicators of progress. So an indicator which I'm particularly interested in the Planning Commission is the share of income that is received by the poorest 40% of South Africans. To do that, I need to know how many South Africans there are. And as the census has reported, there are 10 million more of us. Personally, I think that's a good thing. That's a reflection of us being able to adjust the downward trend in our life expectancy that we experienced during the 2000s. We've rolled out health programs. I'm pleased that there are 10 million people that, as long as they are healthy and employed and have an income that's above the poverty line. That's the goal that we need to be reaching toward. In terms of specific planning, key for municipalities is to know where to direct resources in their local areas. And again, only a census can do that. The surveys that we have do not have large enough sample sizes to enable a municipality to send resources to a particular area. Currently, I'm working a lot in the Breda Valley with the Breda Valley municipality, and key there was how to get resources to people living in Zwelathemba at a time during the COVID lockdown. How do we get food parcels and know where people are most in need? For that, you need a census. So that's the level of detail that a census allows us to work with.
And also just looking at in-migration, gentlemen, we see that the provinces of Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, the Western Cape, also Northern Cape and Mpumalanga, they received more people, whereas you have the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Free State and the Northwest losing people. So, most of these provinces who have received people, especially Gauteng and the Western Cape, have been complaining about a strain on their resources. So, Duma, how is this going to help? Is government actually listening and, adjusting their budgets according to what is happening and what the census tells us?
That is the next issue I was going to talk about, in-migration versus migration from outside South Africa. So the figures clearly show that most of the migration has been within South Africa, not from outside South Africa. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that if you look at Gauteng, the population has doubled, but your infrastructure has collapsed in Gauteng, especially in the major cities like Johannesburg and what you call it, and Tshwane. I was talking to someone recently before the census, and they said the numbers they were using for Tshwane were so dated for 2011, they didn't affect the major growth that has happened in Tshwane, in the municipality. And the same in Joburg. And I just think that our austerity budgets of the past decade, especially, have not kept up with this misguided austerity policies by the government. These are the major reason why we haven't met most of our national development plan targets, because the government, there's been a complete collapse in Johannesburg, for example, where I live, in terms of the delivery of services. So these in-migration statistics show the reasons for that. The housing crisis that you saw in the city, you saw the fires that happened in the city. We just haven't kept up with the growth in the population, because the infrastructure provision must double as well if the population has doubled as well. Yeah.
And that's important, Professor May. I want to bring you in on that for your view as well, considering that you have 56% of the South African population living in those three provinces, Gauteng, the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal.
I absolutely agree with Duma. The concern is that we've had a movement of people. Again, I think our movement of people is entirely positive. I obviously remember a time when people were not allowed to move. So this is a positive sign that we're seeing here. Keeping track of the population and knowing and adjusting the formula, which then reassigns funding from national government to provincial and to local level government, is a key use of the census. It goes into the formula that's used for that calculation. Now, here's an interesting thing, which I never know how I feel about it. I was part of a team back in 2001 that needed to decide whether we should do a census in 2016. A census is an extremely expensive undertaking. At that point, it was running at around 3 billion rand. This census cost close to 4 billion rand due to cost savings, in fact. And we needed to work out whether we could afford as a country to do a census at that time. We estimated the cost of not doing a census, the cost of all those mistakes that Duma has pointed to, and we could only do the financial cost. We couldn't take into account the cost of human life, which again is something we saw in Johannesburg and other places in South Africa when things have gone wrong. The cost in terms of the financial cost was about 1.5 billion rand. So we would have made mistakes. We have made mistakes worth 1.5 billion rand, and we saved 1.5 billion rand. Ultimately, the decision was taken not to do a census in 2016. I still don't know whether that was the right decision. But ultimately, we were asked by the then Minister of Finance, what is the cost and benefit of doing the census? And when you reduce it to rands and cents, that's what we came down to. So that's something to think about when we look at these kinds of exercises. They are very expensive, and we need to decide, do we spend money collecting data, or do we spend money on delivering the services that Duma has mentioned? Personally, I think we need to deliver money. We need to deliver the services as a priority. In terms of the investment, again, if we do not direct enough money towards a province that is receiving migrants, that province is not going to be able to provide things such as education and healthcare, which are the shared mandate of provinces. So that's exactly the concern when we think about whether we should be investing or not. Always, are we investing in the right thing? That's the question.
Duma, I'm sure you'd like to jump in there, because that's an interesting question, but are the two mutually exclusive necessarily?
I think the other issue, because I don't know about this, Professor May probably more detail about it, but I've seen members of the Statistical Council previously complaining about the underfunding of Statistics South Africa. So I'm wondering, many of them have consistently complained about, the impact of the austerity measures on the capacity at Statistics South Africa, because besides the census, there's so many other reports that we should be doing. There's a report that they missed, that they haven't released around international migrants in the workplace that was supposed to be released every 5 years. But I would argue that report shouldn't be released only every 5 years. Perhaps it should be every 2 years. It's such an important, that can inform debates in South Africa around issues of migration. So there are many reports in other sectors of society that we need to know about. So I would agree with Professor May that this is one of the things that we cannot cut spending on, because it is at the nerve center of development, and it allows us how to allocate resources to different areas of our country. It is so important. It is critically important. And we cannot be, cutting your nose to spite your face, as that's what the government has been doing. Yeah. So I don't know about the capacity of, you say it cost 4 billion rands. But I don't know about the capacity of Stats SA to conduct other surveys in society.
Well, gentlemen, I am enjoying this way too much, but we are running out of time very quickly. So I quickly just want to ask both of you with regard to the data that shows that South Africa's population is predominantly young. We know this. 21 million young people between the ages of 15 and 34 being the biggest group in age categories. Now, does the planning follow this data if you consider that youth unemployment, for example, in the country is over 70%? And it keeps growing based on unemployment stats. Very briefly from both of you. Professor?
I think absolutely. The youth are a great priority with the Planning Commission. It's a focus of ours. We have a task team looking exactly at that specific issue. And yes, a predominantly youthful population is an advantage to a country. It can bring a demographic dividend if we can offer them jobs.
But we can't offer them jobs. We can't grow the economy. And every year you have more and more matriculants swelling the ranks of the unemployed. So how is that working for us? Duma?
Yes, this is a thing I also feel very strongly about it. And I work with an organization that's called Youth Capital. And I've done extensive analysis of the youth unemployment problem. There's 7 million young people, 15 to 34, that are unemployed. There's 9 million people who are not in employment, education, or training. This is the type of statistics that, cause revolutions in other countries. And we have to get serious about solving this youth unemployment crisis because it's unsustainable. And just quickly, Sakina, the drivers are actually quite simple for people to understand. For the whole country, the labor force growth rate is about 2.4% a year. The employment multiplier, GDP versus employment, is about 0.9% over the past 20 years. If you take out the periods of dislocation that we had during COVID and during the global financial crisis, it's 0.9. So we need a 4.9% growth rate just to create jobs for the 700,000 people who are going to be entering the labor force until 2030. So we can't afford to be... Yeah.
We are way off from that. But I tell you what, gentlemen, that was just a snapshot. And maybe we should make more time and even expand the panel to really drill down into these statistics. But thank you so much for your time. Director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule, and NDP Commissioner, Professor Julian May, discussing the socio-economic state of the country following the 2022 Census Report that was released by Stats SA yesterday.